It's a nice delay on it.
Hello, everybody. Can you guys hear me okay? Yep. Okay, good. We've passed the sound check, so that's good. I'm just gonna give another minute or so for people to join. We're still just a minute early here. Already got about 100 people in here, so this is awesome. Welcome, everybody. Jane from New Zealand. Lots in the US.
Canada.
Shanna from the cornfields of Illinois. I saw one from Taiwan earlier. One from right here in Louisville, Kentucky. Hello, Jean. I don't think that we've met. I've met Jerry, and I think that you are Mike's dad or stepdad. Nice to meet you virtually.
Oh, we got Joburg and the Philippines. Where's the Ocean State? I'm sorry. I'm British. I don't know.
I am not sure what the Ocean State is. I got to be honest with you.
We're bad Americans.
All right.
Alaska.
So I am also here with my wife, Claire. Hello, Claire.
Hello.
Claire is going to be kind of keeping me on track and also fielding some questions from you guys. And then and then we also have Stella here, who is
trying to get out of the window that's not open.
Who's our lab beagle mix and is just frightened the crap out of herself at the back door. Stella. She's a sweet girl. All right. Welcome, everybody, to this Starter 101 Masterclass. My name is James Bridges, and I am the founder of Sourdough Geeks. And I am also a recently retired professional baker. I first got into sourdough about 12 years ago, and I was working as a chef at the time. And I kind of played around with it for a couple of years, did a few pop-ups and whatnot, featuring bread and but it was mostly a hobby for the first couple of years. And then I was pretty busy as a chef, so didn't have a whole lot of time for baking. Kind of fast forward to the COVID pandemic in 2020. And I hadn't baked much in a couple of years, and when lockdown happened, I started baking again, and I just pretty much never stopped. Within that time, I formed Sourdough Geeks really just as a way to talk to friends, other chefs and bakers, and friends of mine who I thought might be interested in talking about bread, and the group just kind of went crazy. My wife and I, during lockdown, while I was baking, we made the decision to open a bakery.
You made the decision.
She's correcting me. I made the decision to open the bakery. And in the autumn of 2020, I started what was really a community-supported bread program. I was baking 2 days a week, about 15 to 20 loaves per bake. I partnered with some friends that owned a coffee shop and was able to share some commercial kitchen space with them. And that was kind of the start of it. In the spring of 2021, We added a farmer's market, a Saturday farmer's market, and things just kind of took off from there. By the end of that summer, we were building out a brick and mortar location, micro brick and mortar location, and we opened that in October of 21, and we're open until the sort of late spring 2023. And over that time, we just grew and grew, and we added a couple of full-time bakers, and of course my wife was working full-time in the background, and another couple of part-time people. We opened a second pickup location in 2022, and things were just rocking. In 2023, we made a pivot, and we actually closed the bakery. I took a job as a head baker for a local farm-to-table market called Haymarket, where I spent the last year and a half. And then in November of last year, I retired from production baking to focus really all of my energy on what I call breaducation, sourdough geeks, and everything that kind of surrounds it. So this is what I do full time now. So I just kind of want to talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today, and this is really just kind of the basics of starter maintenance, and there's all kinds of ways to maintain a sourdough starter. So what I'm going to share with you tonight is really just what works for me, and what I found to be the most simple and effective way of handling sourdough. And so, there's hundreds of other ways of doing it, but hopefully this can kind of cut through a lot of the noise that's out there and really just kind of zero in on the basics of sourdough maintenance. So just kind of getting started, really the basis for everything sourdough is a healthy and active sourdough starter. And what that means is one that is well balanced between yeast and bacteria, is maintained and fed regularly, and it really just gives you the best opportunity that you can have for successful bakes. The options that are out there for getting a healthy and active sourdough starter are really simple. The first one is that you can make it yourself. It's just a mixture of flour and water and time. The second option is that you can pick one up from a local sourdough bakery, ideally one that is keeping it at ambient temperature and is refreshing it multiple times per day. If you can get one from a local bakery, often they'll give it to you for free. I know that when we had our bakery, we gave out loads and loads of sourdough starter. So that's a really easy way to kind of jumpstart the process and really kind of move from the building and the maturing of a sourdough starter all the way to healthy, active, ready to go. And then the third option would be to purchase one. We do sell my sourdough starter, Larry Levin, who has been going since the beginning of the pandemic. This iteration is a little over 5 years old, never been refrigerated, fed twice a day, most days. And we sell that through the website. There will be a link to that afterwards if you're interested. But again, we're also going to give you information on how to create your own sourdough starter, or how to get a sourdough starter that you already have healthy and active and ready to go. And then really, I just kind of want to reassure you that that with sourdough, you don't need to be perfect. You just need to be consistent. That's really the name of the game here, is to try to be as consistent as possible. And I'm going to give you some feeding regimens that are going to include keeping it at room temperature, which means feeding it every day. And then I'm going to give you some suggestions for what to do if you don't bake that often, or you just don't want to feed it every day. So there are options for keeping it in the fridge or keeping it in a controlled temperature that's going to allow you to feed it less often. I will say that the best way to keep sourdough starter is at ambient temperature and to be refreshed at least once a day. But that doesn't mean that that you can't get perfectly good bread by using a fridge maintenance protocol as well.
Before we go on, can
Yeah.
I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
I'm sure questions are going to start coming in as you start getting into the nitty gritty. How are we going to do that? Do we want people to ask questions as we go along, and then we'll answer after each section?
Yeah, I think that we can do that. So
Okay.
at the end of each section, we can answer some questions if they're coming in. So I'm going to go into flour choices next, and then we're going to go into the different storage options, whether ambient or fridge. Then we're going to talk a little bit about starter hydration, the ideal temperature range, and then we're going to go into feeding ratios and frequency. Pam has just mentioned Broad and Taylor sourdough home. Yes, great method for keeping sourdough starter, and I have one and I use it and I highly recommend it. There are other options as well that that are perhaps not quite as expensive as the sourdough home. I think they run about $100, so it's it's not something that everyone wants to invest in. But yes, I do highly recommend it.
And is this sort of outline available to people afterwards, or how?
So afterwards, everyone in this masterclass is going to get an email afterwards, and the email is going to include our free sourdough starter guide download. It's 10 pages. It includes creating your own starter, maintenance, strengthening, troubleshooting, all sorts of information in there. It's really kind of a an A to Z of sourdough starter. So you're going to get that as a download. You're also going to get, in addition to that, a discount code if you want to become a Sourdough Geeks member, or if you want to purchase sourdough starter, you're going to get an exclusive discount to any of those things included in the email. So that's going to go out to everybody.
Awesome. Right. Are we ready to crack on?
Yep, I think so.
Nice.
All right, flour choices. That's really kind of the first question here, because sourdough starter is essentially just flour and water. There are all kinds of flours that you can use for it. My recommendation is that when you have a healthy and active sourdough starter, that you simply use a strong all-purpose flour or a bread flour, and that's it. There's all kinds of chatter out there about, add some whole wheat to it, add some rye flour to it. It boosts the activity, and those things are true. But it also means that you have to feed it more often, and you have a greater chance of the sourdough starter becoming acidic. And those are two things that are really going to get in the way of you and producing consistently good bread. In my experience, and I'm probably 100,000 loaves in, and the overwhelming majority of those loaves have been made with a sourdough starter that is 100% AP flour. It's consistent. It provides the right amount of food, and it kind of gives a plateau of activity. So you have longer periods of where the starter is at peak and ready to be used. And so it really is kind of an easy button for sourdough starter. So I will also say that if your sourdough starter does not respond after an adjustment to all-purpose or bread flour exclusively, then there's probably a health issue with the starter that needs rectifying anyway. So a healthy and active starter already has the yeast and the bacteria present that it needs to continually propagate. All it needs is food. And so an AP or a bread flour is really the easiest and the simplest way to do that. Now I'm going to go into storage, whether it's kept ambient or at fridge temperature. Really, ambient is ideal, which I've already said. I'm a huge sort of disciple of Ian Lowe, who's a baker based out of Tasmania, and he has sort of 2 golden rules of sourdough. One is keep it between 68 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit and feed it at least once a day, ideally twice. If you can do those 2 things, then it's really hard to end up with bad bread. If you don't do those 2 things, then there's all kinds of issues that can come in. However, it is acceptable to keep it in the fridge with proper care. But what I would say is that before you start putting a sourdough starter in the fridge, you ideally need to get it mature enough that you have the correct yeast and bacteria in it for sourdough fermentation. So I'm going to kind of geek out just a little bit here on the yeast and bacteria that are in sourdough. And you don't necessarily have to fully understand this, but it kind of helps put it into context. Sourdough is a symbiotic relationship between lactic acid bacteria and wild yeast. And the specific type of bacteria that is most commonly associated with sourdough, the type of sourdough that we're making, which is where you're continuously feeding a sourdough starter, includes type 1 heterofermentative bacteria. And those type 1 bacteria, they take a while to begin to show up in a culture. And if you do not keep a culture or the sourdough starter at ambient temperature for ideally, it takes 2 to 3 weeks to establish a new sourdough starter. And then it takes another 2 to 3 months for those populations to really begin to establish and stabilize. And by putting the sourdough starter in the fridge, within 1 week of holding it at fridge temperature, 99% of those type 1 bacteria are going to be gone. At 1 month, 99.9% of those type 1 bacteria are going to be gone. There's still going to be other lactic acid bacteria in there, but not the kind that we really want for consistent fermentation. So if you're going to keep it in the fridge, my advice would be to feed it at least once a week, whether you're baking or not. If you're baking once a week, then that can kind of just be part of your schedule. If you're not baking at least once a week, take it out, give it a feed, a relatively low ratio feed, so that it goes through a full cycle while you're up and able to watch it. And ideally, then give it a second feed. So I would recommend sort of maybe taking it out in the evening, giving it a feed, and letting it rise overnight to ripen, and then the next morning discard, give it another feed, allow it to rise again, and then put it back in the fridge. If you do that at least once a week, then you're going to maintain the correct populations of yeast and bacteria that are going to work most effectively together. And they're also going to be in balance with each other in terms of cell densities. All right, so we kind of went into quite a bit with that.
Yeah,
so,
I've got some questions as well.
Okay.
So we should probably do these now before I lose track of them. So
Okay.
just going back to flour choices,
Yeah.
Kathleen, okay. was asking, is there any benefit of using strong all-purpose flour over bread flour?
I mean, I'm kind of, I'm calling them synonymous with each other. I mean, the truth is that AP and bread flour are more marketing terms than anything else. There's a flour that Costco do. It's a private label, organic AP from Kirkland, and that flour is white label from Central Milling, and Central Milling call it their artisan baker's craft bread flour. So it's the exact same flour. It's just that the marketing department at Costco thought that they would sell more of it if they branded it as an AP, and Central Milling, who work with a lot of bakers, have decided to call it a bread flour. That one is around 11.5% protein, so that's kind of the benchmark that we're looking for. I think King Arthur all-purpose flour is 11.7% protein. The one that I use is Trader Joe's unbleached all-purpose. I use it because it's $3 for a 5-pound bag, and I go through a fair amount of it because I feed it twice a day. So for me, that feeding twice a day is kind of, I jokingly call it my sourdough tithe. That's kind of like, the cost of doing business, as it were, and what I'm given in return is the bounty of beautiful bread. But it can get expensive. So I wouldn't be using, really expensive flour for that. So yeah, I just use the Trader Joe's organic AP in it. And it's,
what percentage is that one? Do you know?
They don't list the protein, but I'm pretty certain that they kind of reverse engineered the King Arthur, because they used to sell the King Arthur and then they stopped doing that. But
Right.
it's very similar. So 11.5 to 12.5% protein. There's going to be a little bit of give and take with protein level in terms of how your starter behaves, how long it holds its peak for, because the stronger the flour, the greater the fermentation tolerance of it. So if you're using a really strong bread flour, then it might hold its volume for longer than a weaker flour, but it's not necessarily any less fermented. So really, the best advice I can give is to try and be as consistent as possible, and to really kind of pay attention to the cues of your starter as it rises and falls.
Okay, so there were a couple of questions about protein. I think percentages, we probably answered those. Just to go back to Don asked, when we're talking about AP, are we talking about malted barley AP or plain AP?
So, and that's a really good question, and that's going to kind of jump us up into a slightly complicated topic, which is amylase activity.
We may not have time for this because I'm watching the clock.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that may be one for one of your regular calls.
Yeah. So the AP flour that I use is malted. I will say this, that if you use one that is malted, that's going to accelerate the fermentation a little bit. So you're going to want to feed that more often than if you're using an unmalted one, in which there's going to be less enzymatic activity, and so it's going to take a little bit longer to ferment. So either way is okay, but whichever one you pick is gonna alter the fermentation time on it.
Okay, and then we had a question from Jane. We had a question from Jane, and someone. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm about to butcher your name. Hukoreshi. I'm going to come back to yours, Jane, but this other question was, we can make levain with add-on flour, but feed AP exclusively. I'm not sure what add-on flour is. I don't know anything about bread baking, people, so bear with me.
I think what they're asking is, if you want to make a loaf that has a different type of flour in the starter,
right? Then
absolutely, yeah. What I'm talking about here is exclusively a continuation starter. It's just the one that is fed regularly. Then if you are making a special loaf and you want to, make a stiff whole wheat starter, or you want to make, put a bunch of rye flour in it, to add that grain and that flavor into the finished loaf, then absolutely you can make leaven with those flours and then just shoot that into the next loaf.
Okay, and then last question for a little while. Jane's question was talking about she has a fluctuating temperature. She doesn't have a sourdough home, and she feeds it twice a day. But if it's not ready to feed at night, when she usually feeds it, is she better off waiting, feeding it early, or feeding it late in the morning?
I generally say it's better to feed it a little bit late than a little bit early. And obviously, I mean, you don't want to be in the habit of doing that too often, and you don't want to be like, continually allowing it to go too long. But as a general rule, the yeast activity happens before the bacteria. So they get going sooner, and then the bacteria kind of catch up at the end because they move faster. But if you are continually feeding it early, then you're going to be weakening it through dilution. So if I'm, in a situation where I find that I'm going to be feeding it too early, I'll generally just if I'm keeping it in my sourdough home and it's warmer in there, and I know that I need to I'm not going to be able to get to it for a good amount of hours, then I'll take it out of there and keep it at a cooler temperature so that it continues fermenting, but not at such a fast rate. But yeah, absolutely. I would recommend that you feed it late, other than overfeeding it early, if at all possible.
Okay, great. Right, we need to press on.
Yeah.
Hydration type. Oh no, we did that. Did we do that? No.
No, we're going to do that next. So hydration type. So there's a lot of stuff out there at the moment about stiff starters. In fact, when I send out Larry Levin, I send it out stiff. I don't actually keep my starter stiff. I send it out stiff because it slows the fermentation rate, and it gives it a better chance of surviving the 2 or 3 days in transit while it's coming to you, because it's sent out live. So I lower that hydration for that purpose. The feeding instructions that I send out include how to bring it back to 100% hydration. And that's really the hydration that I recommend sourdough starter be kept at. And that's really for simplicity more than anything. You don't have to get into complicated math or ratios about, okay, well, how much flour, how much water, then how do I continue to do that? And then when you put it into a loaf, how do you then go to calculate how much of that starter is flour and how much of it is water? It really just it gets more complicated. So for that reason alone, I recommend that you keep it at 100% hydration, which is just equal parts flour, equal parts water by weight. And then it's super easy. When you're calculating how much is in your dough, it's just half and half. It's also easier to mix and to stir it at that hydration. And when you start getting into stiffer starters, I use a mixer for making the batches of Larry that I send out, because it's pretty labor intensive kneading a starter at 50% hydration. So I do recommend, just for simplicity and reliability and for ease of use, equal parts flour and water. Ideal temperature range. So I mentioned earlier about Ian Lowe's 2 golden rules of sourdough. One was keep it between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius, which is 68 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is a reasonable range to keep it in for ideal temperature. But I like to kind of tighten that up a little bit and say that the ideal range would be from 72 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit, with 75 right in the middle kind of being the sweet spot. If you have a way to keep sourdough starter consistently at 75 degrees Fahrenheit, that's the temperature that I keep mine at, then you are going to have a really nice mix and balance between yeast activity and bacterial activity. And it's really been kind of the sweet spot that I've found for it. Now, that being said, the best temperature to keep it at is the one that you can achieve consistently. So if 75 degrees Fahrenheit isn't achievable for you consistently, but 68 or 69 degrees Fahrenheit is, then that's a better temperature for you to keep it at. You're going to have to adjust the feed ratio and the frequency of feeding as a result of that, but you're going to have a much happier culture overall the more consistent that you can keep it. Someone mentioned earlier about they keep it ambient, but they don't necessarily have consistent temperature. That's probably a scenario where they've got a warmer temperature during the day and a cooler temperature at night in their house. Again, you can kind of build that understanding into the feed ratios that you give your sourdough starter. If it's warmer during the day, then we would want to increase the amount that we're feeding it. And then we want to kind of consistently then feed it at about the same time at night, but we want to decrease the amount we're feeding it, knowing that we want it to be ripe again in the morning when we get ready to do that. All right. And then I guess really to jump in from that is really going to be to talk about those feeding ratios and frequency.
There are other questions, but I'm worried that we're not going to get through all of this, and we want to have time for questions as well. So we see your questions.
Right. In terms of feeding ratios and frequency, I'm going to say that there really isn't a one size fits all here. The key to that is going to be to observe your starter and to use all of your senses. Ideally, what we're looking for is we want the starter to be fed at peak activity. Now, there's some confusion in a lot of the groups right now about what peak is with starters. Some people think if it doubles that peak, that's peak. Usually a starter is going to grow more than double in volume. But then once it reaches peak volume, it's not really at peak activity yet. Peak activity is a state that it reaches when it's been at peak volume for some time. And it's most easily characterized by the fact that there are large bubbles covering the surface of the starter. So if it's at peak volume, but it's domed on top and you don't see bubbles everywhere on the top of it, then that's not yet at peak activity. So I would recommend giving it a little bit longer. And the reason for that is because fermentation is exponential. What we're talking about here is the yeast and the bacteria, and how they grow is they multiply. So, and we're talking about numbers in the millions and billions per teaspoon. But if we think about it in simple numbers, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 becomes 16, 16 becomes 32. You get the picture here that rate of cell reproduction is happening at an exponential curve. And therefore, the longer we can leave it, the higher the amount of population is going to be present. And then it's going to hit a stationary stage where it doesn't have a whole lot of available food yet. And so they're going to kind of go into conservation mode. And then eventually, if the conditions don't improve or it's not fed, then you'll start to see some die off and those numbers will start to decrease. But that really takes quite a while to get there. So once it reaches peak volume, it's still got some time to go before it reaches peak activity. Now I'm going to talk about some signs of underfeeding and overfeeding. A sign of underfeeding is when the starter is completely collapsed before you feed it again. So if it's come back down to its original level, then that's hungry and it wanted to be fed earlier. Starter will also get runny. It'll be much more like liquid. Foamy on top. You'll see almost like soap bubbles on top, and a vinegary or rubbing alcohol smell to it. So those are kind of signs that we want to look out for. We want to make sure that we're feeding it before it gets to that point. Overfeeding, again, is an issue. Now, signs of overfeeding, feeding it before it's reached peak activity, would be if it smells like raw flour or just smells really, really mild. And then if it's incredibly thick, like really pasty when you stir it, or if it's slow to rise. So stunting that growth rate is one of the symptoms of overfeeding a starter, and it will begin to get really sluggish. Signs of a healthy and active starter that's ready to be fed are smelling floral or beery or wine-like, maybe even slightly boozy, but not, you know, into the realm of rubbing alcohol or acetone, like nail polish remover. And then the texture of it, we want it stringy. The gluten, as it's developing, will create these strands, and so you want to see those strings as you're stirring it, and you want to hear those sounds of bubbles popping as you put the spoon or the spatula in it to stir it. So those are all like signs that you're feeding it right on time. So now let's talk about some basic feed ratios in specific temperature ranges. Now, I said that 68 to 86, but let's say 68 to 82, just to kind of cut out some of those really warmer temperatures, because keeping it really warm means definitely feeding it at least twice a day and really being on top of it. But in kind of the 68 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit range, and that's kind of your 18 to 19 degrees Celsius for those who are using centigrade. I would recommend a feed ratio of 1 to 5 to 5 if you're going to feed it once per day. If you're going to feed it twice per day, then I would look at doing 1 to 1 to 1, or maybe 1 to 2 to 2. So those ratios are part starter to flour and water. So a higher ratio is a lower inoculation point. And at 68 to 70, on the days that I know that I'm not going to be able to feed mine twice, I'll put it in my sourdough home. I'll turn the temperature down to about 68 degrees. I'll give it a feed of 1 to 5 to 5, and I know that it's going to be good until the next morning. If I'm going to be feeding it twice a day, then kind of play around with that 1 to 1 to 1, which is equal parts of everything, or 1 to 2 to 2. And you may find that somewhere in there is going to be a nice healthy balance for you. If you're keeping it a little bit warmer in kind of the 72 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, I recommend 2 feedings per day at that temperature, 1 to 2 to 2, or 1 to 3 to 3. That's a good starting point, and then, you know, pay attention to it and adapt as needed. If you're keeping it warmer than that, 75 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 to 4 to 4, or 1 to 5 to 5, twice per day. The activity is really gonna increase a lot. As that temperature increases, your fermentation rate increases, but your enzymatic activity increases as well. So everything kind of compounds on you, and you really got to stay on top of it the warmer it is. And then you can actually kind of pick and choose some of those ratios to fit the schedule that's going to work best for you. Say, for instance, you want to feed it at night so that it's ready in the morning. You might give it a larger ratio feed, and then you're good to go in the morning with it. Or you can give it that larger ratio feed at night, and then in the morning, you can give it another feed of a much lower ratio, and then it'll be ready to go around midday for you. So you can kind of adjust those ratios so that the starter's in great condition when you want to use it. At 80 degrees and higher of the starter, at that point you really start needing to feed it more than twice per day. The only time I really use that is if I'm getting ready to make a sweet stiff starter, which has 3 successive builds every 4 hours at about 78 or 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a specific thing that I'm doing to really bring the yeast activity forward on it and to lower the acidity on it. That's also a way that you can get bread that's got higher volume, but with a milder flavor. So there's some things that you can play with at warmer temperatures there, but I don't necessarily recommend keeping your continuation starter at temperatures that warm. So timing those feedings, again, we want to make sure that we're at peak activity when we're giving the starter its next feed, not just the peak volume. So we're going to look for those visual cues. We're also going to use our other senses, and smell is one of the strongest ones that we have. An example that I love to give with this is when you open the fridge and you've got a jug of milk in there that's close to date. The first thing that you do before you pour any of it is you give it a quick smell. And you can tell in an instant without any second thought of, oh yeah, this milk's totally fine and I'm going to use it, or this milk is not fine and I'm going to pour it down the sink. And then you can even tell when it's kind of on that turn and you know, okay, yeah, this milk is okay for me to make my tea with it right now, but I'm definitely going to buy some more milk today and not try and use it tomorrow. We don't need any training. There was no lesson in that we received. It's just permanently ingrained in our memory. And when we get that smell, we know exactly where that milk is. And that's the way you can get with your sourdough starter too. And so if it smells floury and raw and really mild, then you know that it's still young and it doesn't need feeding yet. If it's smelling like really vinegary or almost metallic or like super boozy, like rubbing alcohol, then you can tell, yeah, this starter's hungry and I probably should have fed it already. And then when you smell it and it's got that almost kind of buttermilk sweetness to it, a slight yogurty or buttermilk tang with that floral beer, wine, fermented, those kind of notes, that lets you know that you're kind of in the sweet spot and it's a good time to feed it. And then taste is another one. I mean, I don't recommend going around just like, eating a bunch of raw flour. But it's something that I've kind of always done is I'll just take a little bit of it and stick it on my tongue. And, if I get that really sharp metallic flavor that kind of goes to the back, then I know that it's a little bit hungry and I probably should have already fed it. If it's really mild and I'm not getting any acidity from it at all, then I know that it's still young. I'm looking for that kind of, that sweet spot in the middle of, a light acidity and a slightly milky sweetness from it. All right, next set of questions.
Yeah, they are many and quite sort of so you covered someone was asking about a fruity smell.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, is fruity the same as floral? But I think you said, yeah, it is. Let me just scroll back a bit. I think you mentioned about the sourdough home and the temperature you use that at. But Kimberly was asking, what would you consider the lowest temperature if you're going away for a week? And would you drop hydration as well? She's trying to keep things out of the fridge.
So let me kind of sort of issue a caveat here, and I'll tell you some of the things that I've done, but I also have a really healthy, resilient, active starter that's been fed on the most part 2+ times every day, never been refrigerated. We went back to the United Kingdom over Christmas in December. We were gone for 11 days. I left my sourdough starter out on the counter for 11 days, came back, and it was absolutely fine. And I gave it a bunch of feeds over the next 2 days, and it was back to normal. So I'll temper that by saying that it was Kentucky in December, and so it was quite chilly in the house. And also I have a very healthy and active starter. I also recently, I shot off to Texas to do some consulting work last weekend. And for that, I gave the starter a feed and I put it in my sourdough home at 65 degrees Fahrenheit. I think I fed it 1 to 5 to 5. And I left, I was gone basically 2.5 days. I came back and it was still not quite peaked yet. So that's really effective. So the temperature that really matters for keeping it out of that fridge zone that's going to kill off the type 1 bacteria is 7 degrees Celsius, which in Fahrenheit is about 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you keep it above 45 degrees Fahrenheit, you're in that safe zone of the yeast and the bacteria are both still going to be active. They're still going to be metabolizing, just at a very, very repressed rate. And so a starter can keep for 3, 4, 5, 6 days without needing a feeding in those temperatures. So yeah, I would say that, if you've got your sourdough home, then you can set it for 50 degrees or, somewhere in the 45 to 50 degree range. Give it a nice big feed. Let it kind of give it a little bit of time at room temperature first to get those populations starting to increase. Throw it in the sourdough home and you should be good to go a week later.
Quick fire question. Jeff went back to flour and asked, unbleached enriched flour, yes or no?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes or no. I mean,
that's not helpful.
No, what I mean is that like, a lot of people say like, don't use enriched flour. Enriched flour has saved hundreds of thousands of lives. And, for the most part, I don't see a problem with it. There's a really small segment of the population that has the MTHFR gene mutation that can't get folic acid from flour.
Okay, you're going too geeky now.
But yeah,
I know this is
but I mean, enriched or unenriched, I really don't see any difference between the two. Okay.
And Pam asked a question that was probably very clear at the time she asked it. Pam, ask your question again, please, so that I can understand it. She just says, is that a 12-hour peak? 75, is that a 12-hour peak? I don't know what she means. So ask your question again, Pam, and we'll answer you. Alexis, she's asked a couple of questions. I'm going to pick her second question. Where's it gone? She was talking about oscillating feeding times. Oh, where's it gone? This is hard. Hold on. It's here somewhere. That's her first question. Here. Is it okay to oscillate between 1 times a day feeding and 2 times a day feeding? What's best to keep consistent feeding ratio or temperature?
Yes. I mean, in other words, what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep the sourdough starter in symbiosis as much as possible. And so the temperature and frequency are both levers that we can pull in order to keep that consistency. So if we know that it's going to be longer until we feed, then we can increase that ratio a little bit so that we know that we're giving it more food so that it's not getting hungry too soon. We can also keep the ratio the same and we can reduce the temperature to get the same effect. It doesn't really matter how you get there. What matters more than anything is that the sourdough starter is kept happy. And really is the simplest way that I can put this is listen to your starter and not to us. Like there's going to be all sorts of voices in your head telling you like, feed it this or feed it that or do this or do that. What I'm saying is that the more you pay attention to your starter and begin to recognize what it's asking you for, you're going to be so much better equipped to give it to it.
Alina asked, actually, I think the question was answered by someone else, but I just want to check that I understood it right as well. Alina was asking about this feeding chart that everyone will see in the handout, where you were giving the 1 to 5 to 5 and then all of that stuff. Was that about maintenance or was that about reducing acidity or was that just maintenance?
That's about maintenance. So these are the ratios that you're going to give the starter on a regular basis based on the temperature that you're keeping it at. In terms of the acidity, everything that I'm going over right now is assuming that we have a healthy and active and happy starter and we're just trying to maintain that. If it starts to get out of balance and we're noticing that it's getting more acidic because we can smell it, we can taste it, we're noticing that when we go to stir it, that it's completely loose and liquidy and it's foamy on top. Those are all signs that we need to be feeding it more often. And the way that we get it back into balance isn't by giving it a massive feed to try and reduce that, but by just like working in increments and gently sort of trying to give it a little bit more food, or feeding it a little bit more frequently, rather than these big swings. I know that a lot of people will say, like, if you get an acidic starter, then give it a 1 to 10 to 10 feed. And that does immediately raise the pH, which reduces the acidity. However, it compounds the problem. And this is where it gets a little bit kind of counterintuitive. But if you think about this, that when you're trying to make a loaf of bread that's really sour, the way that you do that is by putting less starter in it. So instead of putting 20% starter in it, you might use 10% or 5%. Well, 10% is basically the same thing as a 1 to 10 ratio with sourdough starter, because starter and dough, they're really the same thing. You know, if you feed, if you create an 80% hydration loaf with 20% starter, then that is a 1 to 5 to 4 ratio, starter, flour, water. That's all it is. And so what happens in your dough is really similar to what happens in your starter. And we know that, like, when we stop bulk fermentation too early, then we have all of those signs of under fermentation. The alveoli aren't fully developed within it. The same is true with the sourdough starter. When we let that loaf go too long, it starts to, the gluten network starts to break down, all of that added acidity and enzyme activity. The same is true with the starter. So that, if you feed a really high ratio, it's going to raise the pH, but then it's going to fall even lower and it's going to end up more acidic. The best way to reduce acidity in a starter is actually to keep it warmer and to feed it low ratios more often. So 1 to 1 to 1 every 4 hours at 78 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. A few of those in quick succession will reduce the acidity in a starter much more effectively than one really big feed will. And then the same is true kind of on the other end as well, that, you know, if you're feeding your starter too often and it becomes sluggish, then really we just need to give it a little bit longer before we feed it the next time, or maybe we need to drop that ratio a little bit until we see all of those bubbles on the surface again, that it's, you know, that it's reached its peak volume, it's no longer domed on top, it's flattened out, or even is maybe just starting to fall, because there's still lots of activity that's going to happen at that point. And so, you know, and then try to give yourself a little bit of grace as well. Like you know, if you're, you know, a little bit early or a little bit late, then, you know, in the grand scheme of things, you're going to be able to even it out, as long as you're paying attention to it and you're reading the cues visually with your, you know, with your olfactory and taste buds, then you're going to be in a good spot with it.
Well, there are so many questions which are asking for specific advice for their situations, and I just don't think we have the time because we've still got more to go into. But just quick thing: if someone's starter is smelling floral, that's good, right?
That is good. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And in this notes that people are going to have afterwards, they're going to get that feeding chart which mentions the temperatures and the frequency, like, for feeding.
Loretta's got a comment here that says 25% of the population has MTHFR. That's actually incorrect. It's less than 1% of the population, and there's only one MTHFR gene mutation that affects the body's ability to process folic acid. And if you have that mutation, then you should not be eating gluten either. So I'm misinformation. I really want to squash that. And so enriched flour really is not an issue unless you are one of less than 1% of the population that has that specific mutation. of the MTHFR. And if you have that, then you really shouldn't be eating bread in the first place.
Okay, cool. So, but people are getting this handout. Okay, so all those other questions, is there a way that people can get some of these questions answered after? Because we've only got 5 minutes left or 7 minutes left to get through these final tips.
Points, yeah.
And
there absolutely is, and you know, the easiest way for you all to do that. So we do have a Sourdough Geeks membership, which gives you access to a private Facebook group that right now there's about 400 or 500 people in there. So a much smaller group than in the main group, which is like pushing 900,000 now. And so the signal to noise ratio is much better in there. I'm regularly in there, as are the other admins and moderators. And as a member of that group, you also get additional access through a group chat where you can show us your pictures of your bakes and your starter, and we can coach you through it on a much more individual basis. And then in addition to that, twice a month, we do a group call, which is called Bread Talk. That's on the first Friday and second Saturday of every month. So the next Bread Talk is actually in 2 days, which is going to be the first Friday of May. That membership is $5 a month or $50 a year. And then at the end of this, you're going to get a discount code for, I think it's 15% off of that. So it's an incredible value. Sign up for that, and you're going to get, you know, much more personal attention and access to me, the other admins, and other bakers who have been through the same thing that you're going through.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, good. I don't feel so bad now because I'm thinking, oh, they've got questions.
Yeah.
Okay, so troubleshooting. We should do that bit quite quickly, I think, can't we?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, I've kind of already gone into that, and that's really that, you know, when you get a starter that's smelling vinegary or really pungent, then you know that, okay, I've been underfeeding that. I need to increase that feed ratio or frequency gradually. So if you've been feeding it 1 to 1 to 1 and you've only been feeding it once a day, well, that's a recipe for an acidic starter. So increase that to 1 to 2 to 2. Do that twice a day, you know, reassess it in a few days. Normally it's going to take a few days for it to begin to balance out again. But make those gradual steps rather than kind of swinging from pillar to post. The same is true if you feel like, okay, I may be overfeeding. This came up recently in the group because people were saying, oh, like feed it peak to strengthen it. And then we started asking people, show us a photo top down of your starter at peak. And people were sharing them, and we were looking at it, and we were just like, yeah, that's not peak yet. And so they're feeding it too soon, and that's creating a sluggish and weak starter because we're diluting those populations. So if it's slow, if it smells floury, if it's feeling a little bit sluggish, then we just want to reduce that feed ratio or reduce that frequency and let it begin to come back to life in terms of getting those fermentation aromas and those bubbles and that activity back. Again, it's probably going to take 2 to 3 days for that correction to really begin to take hold. And then, you know, just kind of summarizing that is focus on consistency most. Focus on observation, like really pay attention to your starter. And it's, you know, it's not prescriptive or transactional in nature. Like you really do have to have an active listening type relationship with your sourdough starter to understand what it wants and what it needs. And gentle adjustments, like don't don't subject it to extremes one way or another. Try to keep that temperature in a nice even range. If you're putting it in the fridge, like I said, take it out once a week at night, feed it, let it rise overnight, give it another feed in the morning, observe it. Smell it, like check in with it. And the more you check in with it, the more of those cues you're just going to kind of absorb through osmosis. And before you know it, you won't need to ask any questions about it. You'll just intuitively know exactly where your starter is and what it's asking for. And don't chase perfection with this. Like, honestly, it's the beauty of sourdough is that it's incredibly forgiving. That's also the frustration of it. But try and chase that balance between giving your starter what it wants and also having that healthy balance of what you have going on in your life as well. All right, so that's right at an hour now.
Yeah.
Just quickly in closing, I just wanted to remind you guys that you're going to get an email that's going to have that free download to the 10-page starter guide that's going to have so much that we've just covered and more in terms of troubleshooting and everything from starter creation to maintaining to when it gets a little bit out of whack. You can purchase Larry Levin from me. We send it out twice a week. And it's, Tom Cucuzza from the Sourdough Journey. He bought one not long ago. He said it was the strongest starter that he's ever seen. It's just starter to me. I mean, I guess I don't really, have a whole lot of experience outside of that. But I'm 100% confident that if you're struggling with getting a starter going, that if you buy one from me, that your bread will improve. And in fact, I recently put up a post that said that if your bread doesn't improve with following the recommendations, and you buy a starter from me, send us an email and I'm going to refund 60% of the purchase price, which means that all we're doing is we're covering the packaging and the shipping for it. But if your bread doesn't immediately improve, then I want to give you that money back. And then also you can join the private group, 15% off. $5 a month is, with 15% off, we're talking, a cup of coffee a month. You're going to get access to me, the other admins, a much smaller engaged group where you're going to be able to answer questions in real time through live chats, and you're going to get group calls as well. So we've got a whole lot going on to really assist people that are looking for that extra. And then also keep an eye out for more lives like this. I'll be sharing about them in the group, and we'll try to do these regularly moving forward as well.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you all so much. Hope you all have a great night.
Bye.